So first of all, I'd like to say, wow. I've had a great time at this conference, and I have learned great things, and I appreciate everyone sharing all their information with me. And I'd like to say thank you to the Tennessee Department of Agriculture and Forestry Services, as well as the Southern Products Bureau and Forestry Services with Tim and David. You guys have done a great job. But I'm not sure that what I'm about to talk about today can top that tour at Graceland yesterday. That was just phenomenal. I appreciate that. I learned more about Elvis than I never knew, and it was a good thing. So anyway, so as I said, as Neil gave you this big old scenario. I am Laney Campbell. I've spent 30 years with my career now with APHIS. Do I just push this red button? I guess I push this one. There you go. So 3 more years I can retire. I'm excited about that. So what I'm going to teach you about today is I'm going to talk about export certification and trade. And some people tell me I talk really fast for a North Carolinian. So if I get too fast, just raise your hand and I'll slow down. I do have an auctioneer background, so I do get kind of fast sometimes. So anyways, and when we talk about phytosanitary certificates, the first thing I'd like to let you know is that's about plants. Had a guy call me one day and he said, I need one of those phytos. And I thought he was talking about a dog, and we didn't take care of dogs, but anyway. So anyway, seriously what we do is a phytosanitary certificate is a plant-based certificate. This is actually something that's developed within the international standards. If you've ever heard of international standards, and I'm sure you guys know about ISPM 15. Well, Phyto's international standard comes from international standard number 12. It is a standard that developed a standard form for what a phytosanitary certificate is. Each country has the same format. In each block, we all put the same material. How they design it and what kind of paper and seals they use is solely up to them. But within the standard regulates what must be on that certificate and what we can and cannot put on that certificate. APHIS does not require phytos. It's a service that we provide to industry. But 99% of the countries that you export a commodity to does require a phytosanitary certificate, simply because they want to know that we inspected it. I'll be honest with you folks, our phytos hold a lot of integrity. They hold a lot of integrity into foreign countries. They just want a piece of paper that says it was inspected by one of our officials. And that's pretty much what a phyto does. We issue that certificate telling that country that we inspected that commodity for the pest of concern that they are worried about that could become established in their country. Sometimes a foreign country requires an import permit. Some of them make it mandatory. Now, sometimes that import permit will stipulate special restrictions that they want us to apply to those shipments before we actually export them. Foreign countries determine import requirements. That's not something that APHIS does. That is something that is negotiated between all foreign countries. I know that the sulfuric fluoride use came up earlier today. I'll go ahead and tell you that yes, APHIS has approved through our science division the use of sulfuric fluoride for wood treatments. But in having said that, that doesn't mean that our foreign trading partners has accepted that as a treatment that they will receive that commodity under yet. So those are still going through formal negotiations with our National Plant Protection and Quarantine officials in each country. So you will have some treatment options, but what countries will accept it yet, we do not know. And most of you, if you export a commodity, call an accredited certifying official. That is actually a state or a federal employee. And in California, we certify the counties. And that's just a division of another agriculture entity that has entered into a memorandum of understanding with APHIS so that we can all perform those duties, so we try not to hold industry up so that you can move your commodities. So, am I talking too fast? Doing good. Okay, so another thing I want to talk to you about, and since we're at a forestry conference, is some of the export challenges specific to forestry products. So for all forestry products, one of the biggest things we have when we begin to certify your shipments is knowing the true origin of that commodity. Our ACOs and our officials are truly at the mercy of you for providing that, because a log usually doesn't have a tag on it. It usually doesn't have a stencil. It has nothing on it that we can trace it back to the tract of land that it was grown on, cut on, moved, and produced and went to port. Unlike a fruit, vegetable, or a bale of cotton, I can tell you where it grew, what field it came from, what farm produced it, all by a tagging system that each one of them requires. Logs, we can't do that. Another thing that hinders sometimes wood exports is bill of sales, state phyto issuance. These are some things that could actually help you. For instance, how many of you run into a situation where you can't move your logs from Indiana to California because of an emerald ash borer quarantine? You probably run into that sometimes, but there is some things called a sunshine clause. There are certain times of the year that you can move them, that the beetle is not active. But sometimes a state PC, which is a state phytosanitary certificate, if you're going to move logs like from Georgia to South Carolina, there's not a pest issue. If you have a state official send that along with it, guess what it does? It helps us determine for that foreign country that, hey, it came from an area that was not infested with a quarantine pest that is important to the country that we're about to send that commodity to. Another thing we have some challenges with sometimes is really knowing what the true genus and species of that log is. I'll be honest with you, we see hundreds of thousands of logs a day, and you know, I grew up on a farm. I can tell you when the tree's growing what it is, but when it's cut, I can't really tell you what it is because I can't see leaves. I don't see the fruit it produces. But when it's just a log there, our officers have a really hard time determining the species and the genus of that log. So if you can make sure that they truly know what that is, it makes certification of your product a whole lot easier. Chain of custody is another issue that we run into with certifying logs. Documentation, tagging of logs, I mean, those kinds of things we depend on you as an industry because the log, wood chip, and lumber industry is so different than about 90% of the other industries that we deal with for plant-based exports. Chips. The biggest thing with those is a lot of the chips we get are already heat treated, but we just don't have anything from the mill that chipped them to know that they've already been through that. So the more you can produce as an industry for us to see what you got, the better it helps us with your export certification inspection. Okay, and here's some tools that can actually help your workload. I don't know, it helps our workload. We all know, and I'm sure you've seen, government's not getting any bigger. We're getting smaller. We have actually seen through our USDA department where we've had several agencies that have now been combined. They've been now looking at other agencies to see what we do and where overlap's at to continue to put us together. It's just reduction in workforce through attrition when people begin to retire. So, but one thing that we have done to actually help you is, how many of you have ever heard of the National Wood Compliance Agreement? If you ship lumber, it's a great thing. We've also adapted it where it can be used for logs and chips. So it actually allows you as an industry, APHIS gives you some part of the inspection to do to assist us so that we don't hold your product up, and then the final phytosanitary inspection, we come in and help do it. But there's some part of that entity through a compliance agreement that you can do. And each one of those compliance agreements will have a stipulation in it specific to your mill, to your state, or to your industry, and we will use that to help. There's also a couple of other things we have, the mill certification programs, the heat treatment, the KD programs, and out west they use something called a debarking and a grub hole program. We use those, and it's simply just you providing us documentation that you belong to one of these accredited programs, either the American Lumber Standard Committee or the National Hardwood Lumber Association. There's graded agency programs. Those are all things that help us help you export your things better. A few more tools that we can use to help you guys out, and it actually helps our workload, or we like for our exporters to be familiar with the commodity they're sending. Thank you, Anna. And when you guys as an industry are familiar, or your broker is familiar with what they're sending, it really helps us out because, number one, they are able to go into the Phytosanitary Issuance and Tracking System, which we call PSET, and actually look up the requirements of that commodity, and they know ahead of time what's going to happen to it, what the official has to do, and what documentation they need to be able to present for us to do official inspections. PEXD actually stands for our Phyto Export Data System. It's a system with real-time information from the foreign country as to what those requirements are that we will need to meet for that particular shipment. Our authorized ACOs there, we've talked about those. There are some things we have now called digital signatures. If you're not familiar with those, I would ask that in your state, Shannon back there is one of our officers here in Tennessee. There are some companies that we allow now to apply signatures digitally. It helps. There's also something we use down there called we're at the exporter applicant request, we can do what we call an official certificate print authorization, which actually gives you the ability to print that certificate in your office. It's been a great tool when it's used correctly. So those are some things, but those are all, when you ask about one of those, they're all granted through our export services staff. That's our Washington office. So there'll be certain criteria that you will be asked and they will look into to make sure you are authorized to apply any of these particular measures to your shipments. They're great programs. If you don't know about them, ask your local ACOs who inspect your products. Okay, so we'll talk about some product-specific issues. The majority of you in here, when you ship, are you shipping logs or are we shipping everything? Lumber, chips? Okay, so lumber, here's some specifics for the issues with lumber. Okay, when we come to inspect lumber prior to container, so we like to make sure that before we inspect your lumber, we do it before it's put in a container. The reason being is our officer gets to see the entire bundle of the lumber. We get to see the marks. How many of you know right now that if it's not completely 100% squared edged and bark free, the European Union is going to turn it around and send it back. When it's put into a container, our certifying officials can't see that entire bundle. And it's nothing that you did wrong, it just makes it easier for us. So if you're loading containers and can get an inspection before they're loaded, that's 100% plus for you guys, and it doesn't hold you up at port either. Another thing is we ask that but once it's containerized, it's just really difficult for us to inspect. We can only inspect one end of it. So another thing that helps expedite certification is adequate documentation. If your lumber is heat treated, what grading agency you used, additional declarations or documents that are necessary to show us if the product was heat treatment, has it been kill and dried, has it been fumigated, any of those kinds of things helps us assist you in moving your commodity faster. Chips. We actually ship a lot of chips out of Savannah, Georgia. We have a ship that loads out of there probably about once a week with chips going to Turkey. That is actually an in-transit fumigation treatment that we've set up many years ago with the shipping industry down there, and we treat it en route with phosphine. It's actually a system that has piping in the bottom of in the big container of the ship, and as the ship travels, the phosphine moves through the railing, and it has little holes in it, so it pumps the gas up and around so it moves. But it's been very effective. And what's really interesting with this particular treatment is, Turkey tries really hard to be a member of the European Union, but they've not quite made that yet. But they're the only country within the European Union right now has been shipping, that has allowed us to do the in bulk, en route, shipboard treatments like that. And it's really been really effective and successful. Another thing is heat treatment. Shavings that you have obtained after kill drying. We get a lot of shavings like that. In other words, for pet bedding, a lot of pet bedding, this is what happens to the chips. They're already kill and dried, and they just shave the boards up there, and that's the way we ship it. And the other thing that's really hard, and one reason we struggle with sending chips to the European Union, is the fact that we can't get the chips heated to 300 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. It pretty much burned the chips up at that. But we've not been able to meet the European Union's requirements for that. So that market's not been really great for us here lately, but we have had some negotiations with the European Union in the last 2 months, so we're hoping things are moving forward. So some more product-specific issues with chips and shavings is fumigation. I mean, we can treat them with methyl bromide. We prefer to do phosphine. That actually works better on the chips. And we can do those in transit. Although phosphine treatments are not approved for the European Union, we do it for Turkey. China will only allow us to use methyl bromide right now. The sulfuric fluoride, methyl, and phosphine have already gone forward. There's actually a bilateral meeting coming up with China pretty soon, and these articles are on the table to be discussed. And the other thing is treatment must be monitored by an ACO, an official accredited certifying official. But what's cool with that is we actually have developed now a new national export treatment compliance agreement, which is between the company and the pest control applicator. So there are some things in there that you can actually do as an industry to treat your product, and an official doesn't have to be there all the time. So another issues that we run into are cants and logs. I never knew what a cant was until many years ago, and I figured out it was just a log that's been squared up really big. But this is a thing that we run into with the international language of commodities. Some countries call cants a log just because of the diameter and the size of it. So if that's the case, then when we get ready to export it and inspect it for you, they require that we actually treat it just like a log. So if it required Pinewood Nematode testing, we would have to drill it and test it, and vice versa. So it can actually be harmful to your log, or it causes you to lose board footage and all that kind of stuff. Another thing is debarked material and specific tolerances for bark. Most countries will tell us they'll accept 5% or less, but that's not normally true. Sometimes over 2%, they reject the shipment. That's where all your pests are normally carried in your bark most of the time. The number of log yards that are requesting inspections has grown tremendously over the last 2 years for APHIS. And we don't have all the personnel to be out there all the time. So that's why we work really close with our state departments of ag and in California, our counties. So we just ask that one thing that industry does, if you know you've got a shipment moving and we can inspect it before it's containerized and moved to the port, we can probably get to it a whole lot faster. So we just ask that you be aware of that. Another thing are heat treatments, the effectiveness of the product and the size. So heat treatment based on the size of the lumber can be tricky, especially for the European Union markets. You can't always get, because when they say heat treatment, they want the internal temperature of that log or that piece of lumber to reach that 56 degrees C for 30 minutes. And it's difficult with some species of wood and some sizes of wood to do that. And of course, one of the other issues we run into when treating logs is the actual temperature of the log. The ambient temperature is not something that you look at in order to determine how much gas to apply to those logs to be treated. It has to be the internal temperature of the log, and it's really hard to determine the internal temperature of the log sometimes. Another thing is the place of inspection. We talked about this earlier. You know, it's really great that we can go to the log yard and inspect, but when it goes to the port, we only see the butt ends of the logs, and it doesn't help with inspection because our inspectors can't see everything in there. So if there is a hitchhiking pest on that log, or if you had logs treated and it failed fumigation, we don't see those bugs because we can't see the tail ends of the logs that are pushed up in the back of the container. Another thing is species. We can't tell the species once the logs are containerized. So we would prefer they be inspected at the log yard. The only challenges with that is once they're inspected, you need to make sure they're up off the ground. There's no soil contamination. If they determine that we need pinewood nematode testing if they're going to China, that takes another bit of time. And then you cannot ship those logs until your pinewood nematode samples come back from the lab, determine that they are negative of pinewood nematode. Then we can treat them and send them if they're going to China. So, and after the treatment or any kind of sampling, they're supposed to be maintained and safeguarded and kept away from any other thing else. So you wouldn't want to mix logs that have been inspected with a new shipment that's not been inspected yet or you're not going to move yet. Okay? And the reason for that is hitchhiking pests. So logs inspected at the port is difficult. And I'll tell you this, 90% of the notices of non-compliance we get back for a pest is because the logs were inspected at the port. Our officers just can't see everything. So another issue with forestry products that we look at when it comes to shipping is the fact that we have to be aware of the inspection dates. And what this means is when you request a phytosanitary certificate, there's two different dates that a country looks for. The date it was inspected and the date the phytosanitary certificate was issued. So you as an exporter have to make sure that you understand that and you've read that and looked at that within the PSET system. And if it looks like your shipment's going to miss the deadlines, then all you got to do is call and we'll reissue your phyto for you. Don't wait till it gets on the water and say, oh, I forgot to get my phyto, or oh, my phyto expired. It's a little difficult to help you at that point. Okay? Policies and time limits and arrange for shipments to be reinspected. Or if they can't be reinspected, if we have a phyto, we're okay with reissuing it. So I know I went through that fast, but I like to do that because I usually get lots of questions. And I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I think we have about 7 minutes. So I want to open up the floor to questions if that's okay with Tim and Neil and everybody. So.
We have any questions? We've got time.
So I'm a hardwood guy, but this pinewood nematode, what exactly are the steps? You're going to test for the pinewood nematode and then it's fumigated if that's necessary?
Actually, if you're going to China, China's truly the only country that allows us, that requires us to inspect for pinewood nematode. We will actually, either the industry can pull the sample with one of our officials being with you. There's a specific pinewood nematode protocol that was negotiated with the Chinese on where they want the sample taken and how deep the sample has to be. We have a few approved labs that the sample can be sent to. And if your sample comes back negative, at that point, if it's going to China, you can apply the fumigation and send it. If it comes back positive, you cannot send those logs to China, even with a treatment.
Hi, question about hardwood logs and inspections. In our area up in Indiana, we have trouble getting the inspectors to come on a more timely basis. And as we see ourselves ramping up, we're going to find ourselves at the mercy of your department to come in more often than we've seen now, and we're seeing a little bit of pushback on that. Is there, other than this compliance agreement, is there anything we can do to help expedite that so that when they come it's quicker, or if there anything else we can do to schedule more often visits or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know where I talked about there how time limits the date of inspected and the date of shipping and issuing your phyto? We actually do this down at the Port of Wilmington, North Carolina, because we ship a lot of logs out of there. We actually have a team of officers rotate through, and they'll go through every 2 weeks, and the shipments that have been inspected and tested, they're put aside and safeguarded so that whenever it's ready to ship your shipment, and that officer's already looked at that, when you know that load is ready, but you don't know when it's going to ship, they keep an inventory list, and they'll say, okay, inventory A from pad so-and-so, it's already been inspected, so the certificate can be issued. So it would be something that we could look at with the Department of Indiana as well as the APHIS inspectors on how often they can be there with a continual rotation so that we can say your commodity's been inspected. And it's a little different with hardwoods than it is with softwoods. They don't require the type of Pinewood Nematode testing. So that is something we could work on.
Looking at the compliance agreements, is it possible if we as a company would have a compliance agreement with you, but the containers are being loaded at a transship facility down at the port, to have the material inspected at the port, or does it have to be at the original sawmill?
The compliance agreements is with the sawmill, Anna, so that we can make sure they're doing what it says. Once that inspection part's done, however it travels, is outside the phytosanitary realm.
So the material would need to be inspected at the sawmill level, not at the transship facility.
If we like that better because we get a more thorough inspection and we can make sure your product doesn't encounter any problems when it arrives at the foreign country if we can't get the inspection we need to do at the port. Because we don't want to charge you fees to devan it because we got to see it all.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Got one. Got one.
I heard a guy mention today, and I've run into it too, if there's a lot of dirt or mud on the logs, what is are you looking for nematodes in the dirt?
Actually, the dirt it doesn't have anything to do with a pest. Sometimes it is a nematode, but there is an international standard for zero tolerance of soil among all trading partners. So if we send them something that has soil on it, they're going to send it back. There are even issues now where we ship nursery stock that can't be in soil. They must be some type of sterile growing media, which is a formicomite or a moss. So there is no soil that is allowed to move back and forth between international countries. So that's why we say if you keep it up off a pad or you put it somewhere secure up a little bit, you won't get a soil contamination. Yeah, I see there are logs underwater in Wilmington.
All right. I think that's it. Thanks.